The story of William the Conqueror is one of the most epic and controversial of all time. For many, his journey from a bastard duke to the King of England is the personification of ambition and victory. But what if the story we know is just the tip of the iceberg? What if, behind the glories of conquest, there are layers of violence and oppression that forever change the destiny of a people? Get ready to dive into a narrative where the hero and the tyrant become one. It's a story that starts with a broken promise and ends with a nation transformed. It is the journey of a man who risked everything and whose victory redefined not only England, but the very structure of power in medieval Europe. If you enjoy diving into epic stories like this and seeing how the past shaped our present, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Every subscription, like, and share helps us spread knowledge and motivates us to bring you more stories like this. And if you could suggest the next story, what would it be? Leave your suggestion in the comments and tell us which city or state you're watching from. At the dawn of the 11th century, England, a land once fragmented by centuries of invasions and disputes, seemed to have found a fragile balance. Under Anglo-Saxon unification, the kingdom was a mosaic of power and loyalty, ruled by a succession of monarchs who fought to maintain peace and consolidate their authority. Power did not reside solely in the hands of the king. It was shared with powerful earls, nobles who controlled vast regions and had their own armies, sometimes becoming rivals to the throne. The House of Wessex, which had forged English unity, now faced a complex web of alliances and tensions. Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred the Unready, ascended the throne in 1042. His reign, lasting almost 24 years, is often portrayed as a period of peace and religious devotion. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord were being planted. Edward, who had spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, was deeply rooted in Norman culture and customs. He brought Norman advisors and friends to his court, granting them land and power, which created resentment among the Anglo-Saxon nobility who saw their influence diminishing. The issue of succession was the central point of all the tension. Edward, a pious and ascetic man, remained childless. The absence of a direct heir turned his kingdom into a powder keg, with different factions vying for the throne. The main force of opposition to the Normans was the powerful family of Harold Godwinson. As Earl of Wessex, Harold was the wealthiest and most influential man in England, rivaling the king himself in power and popularity. His sister Edith was the queen consort, Edward's wife, which made the Godwinson family an unavoidable factor in royal politics. Edward's court was a stage for intrigue, where loyalty was fluid and promises were uncertain. The absence of a legitimate heir opened the door to a series of claims, and the kingdom became increasingly vulnerable to invasions and civil war. The Anglo-Saxon nobles, although they respected Edward, viewed the growing Norman influence with suspicion. The Normans, who had close ties to the king, were beginning to feel they were part of England's future. This was the scene, a kingdom in apparent calm, but with a fragile line of succession, divided between loyalties and cultures, ready to explode into one of the most decisive conflicts in European history. The story of William the Conqueror cannot be told without addressing the stigma of his origins. He was not just William, Duke of Normandy, but to many of his contemporaries, he was William the Bastard. His illegitimate birth, an undeniable fact of his life, was both a burden and a catalyst for his relentless ambition. Son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva of Falaise, a woman of modest origins, William was born in circumstances that placed him in a socially precarious position. Herleva was not Robert's wife, but his concubine. Although the union was recognized by Norman customs, it did not have the status of a royal marriage, and this meant that, in the eyes of many in feudal Europe, William's lineage was tainted. This stain was not just a matter of personal honor, it was a point of political and social vulnerability. Rival nobles in Normandy and neighboring rulers used his illegitimacy as a weapon to undermine his authority and question his right to rule. Public humiliations were frequent. During one of his sieges, the town's defenders hung raw hides from the walls, shouting that the Duke was a bastard and that his mother had worked in a tannery. Even if the story of the tannery was likely an invention to insult him, the message was clear. His illegitimate origin was a cause for mockery and disrespect. Far from being crushed by this burden, William transformed it into a source of fierce determination. He strove to prove his worth and forge an identity that would be unquestionable. Every military victory, every act of government, and every strategic alliance was a response to the insult that had followed him since birth. The conquest of England was not just an act of territorial expansion, but a monumental act of personal legitimation. By becoming king, he would erase, once and for all, the title of bastard and replace it with conqueror. This quest for recognition and the obsession to transcend his humble origin are the drivers behind his ambition, making him one of the most complex and ruthless characters in history. The legend of his illegitimacy is, therefore, the starting point for understanding the strength of his personality and the grandeur of his actions. The life of William the Bastard was marked by chaos from the start, a prelude to the Iron Man he would become. His childhood was not that of a young prince protected and prepared to rule, but rather that of a survivor in a hostile court. When his father, Duke Robert I, left on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1035, he designated William, then just 7 or 8 years old, as his successor. The decision was extraordinary and dangerous. The Norman nobility, a group of brutal and ambitious men, would not accept the idea of being ruled by an illegitimate child. Robert's death on the return journey sealed William's fate and plunged him into a decade of turmoil and violence. The lack of a strong leader triggered a disguised civil war. Rival nobles began fighting for power and territory, and the young duke became the prize or the obstacle that everyone wanted to control or eliminate. Assassination attempts were common, and William's guardians died one by one in violent ways. His protector and master, Gilbert of Brienne, was murdered by a rival noble. Another guardian, Turcotil, was also killed. His uncles and closest allies fought to keep him alive. Death became a constant in his life, and he witnessed the brutality of his peers up close, which forced him to mature extraordinarily quickly. This dangerous youth indelibly shaped William's personality. Mistrust became his second nature. He learned never to fully trust anyone, to see loyalty as something to be earned and maintained by force. The cruelty of the nobles in his duchy taught him about the fragility of power and the need to exercise absolute authority to survive. He became a ruthless leader, focused on imposing order and eliminating any threat to his hegemony. The absence of a normal childhood, the constant threat to his life, and the need to assert himself in such a hostile environment are the keys to understanding the fierce determination that would later lead him to cross the English Channel and conquer England. Survival became his main lesson, and force his main means. William's turbulent youth, filled with conspiracies and betrayals, gave way to a period of power consolidation, where he, now a young adult, demonstrated his brutality and sagacity. After years of fighting to survive, William, now around 19, faced the ultimate rebellion that would test his ability to rule. In 1047, a coalition of Norman nobles, led by Guy of Brienne, his own cousin, rose up against his authority. They saw William's youth and illegitimacy as a weakness and wanted to depose him to divide the duchy among themselves. The rebellion became a turning point, forcing William to prove that he was not just a survivor, but a legitimate and powerful ruler. Without hesitation, William sought the support of his lord, King Henry I of France. He knew he needed allies to crush the rebellion. Together, the armies of William and Henry confronted the rebels at the Battle of Hastings. The victory was decisive. William fought on the front line, demonstrating bravery and leadership, and the rebels were crushed. Those who were not killed or captured fled, and the young duke's authority was re-established. Hastings was a landmark, not only for being his first great military victory, but for establishing beyond question his dominance over Normandy. After the victory, William began to systematically subdue the nobles who still opposed him. He relentlessly pursued them, confiscating their lands and castles. Many were exiled and some were executed. The repression was brutal but effective. He built motte and bailey castles, wood and earth, at strategic points to ensure military control over the duchy. The alliances he formed, such as his marriage to Matilda of Flanders, daughter of the powerful Count Baldwin V, in 1051 or 1052, reinforced his power, and gave him a status of international respect. The marriage was initially forbidden by the Pope, which only reinforced William's determination to make it happen. William's authority over the duchy was now consolidated. He was no longer the young bastard at the mercy of his nobles, but a strong, ruthless, and respected leader. Normandy was unified under his iron fist, and now he could turn his ambition beyond the English Channel, towards England. The political scene on the deathbed of Edward the Confessor was a powder keg, and the key to understanding William's claim to the throne of England lies in a series of ambiguous events and contested promises. William's claim that he was the legitimate heir did not come out of nowhere. It was based on a supposed promise made to him by Edward the Confessor himself. The bond between the two was strong. Edward, who had spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, had a deep affinity for Norman culture, and possibly a sense of gratitude to William for having supported him. William's narrative is as follows. In 1051, he visited Edward's court. During this visit, Edward, who had no heirs, allegedly promised William that he would be the next king of England. This promise, if true, would have been a state secret and an affront to the Anglo-Saxon nobles, especially the Godwinson family. The Norman account of the story states that the promise was legitimate, and for them, William's claim to the throne was irrefutable. However, the story is more complex. One of the most crucial and controversial events was Harold Godwinson's visit to Normandy in 1064 or 1065. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the main sources of the time, Harold was captured by a Norman nobleman, and to be released, he was forced to swear an oath of fealty to William, promising to support his claim to the English throne. The veracity of this oath is one of the greatest historical debates. The Normans claimed that the oath was sworn on sacred relics, making it unbreakable. The Anglo-Saxons, in turn, argued that the oath was made under duress, and therefore was not valid. Edward, on his deathbed, would have, according to Anglo-Saxon tradition, changed his mind, or perhaps he had never promised anything to William. With his last breaths, he would have pointed to Harold Godwinson, present by his side, and named him his successor. The debate over who Edward really chose to be his heir, and whether he even had the right to do so without the approval of the Council of Nobles, the Witan, will never be resolved. What is known is that the promise of succession, true or false, served as the moral and legal pretext William needed to launch his invasion, turning a power dispute into a war of honor and revenge. With the death of Edward the Confessor, the fragile balance of power in England collapsed. The nation awaited the next step, but the decision was not long in coming. The Witan, the Council of Anglo-Saxon nobles and leaders, met in London to choose the new king. The options were limited. Edgar the Etheling was the direct heir of the royal line, but he was too young and lacked power. William's promises were known, but he was a foreigner, and his legitimacy was questionable. And then there was Harold Godwinson. Harold was not of royal lineage, but his position was unparalleled. He was the Earl of Wessex, the wealthiest and most powerful region in the country, and the most influential and popular man in England. His brother Tostig, Earl of Northumbria, was one of his main rivals. Harold had demonstrated his ability as a military and political leader, and his family, the Godwins, had dominated English politics for decades. The choice of the Witan, which sought a strong and experienced leader to guide the kingdom, was unanimous. They ignored Edward's promises to William and the claims of other contenders. On January 6, 1066, the same day as Edward the Confessor's funeral, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was an act of defiance. Harold knew William would not accept the decision. He had sworn an oath of fealty to William, even if under coercion. For William, Harold's coronation was a betrayal, an affront to his honor and his right to the throne, and he used this as his main motivation for the invasion. In Normandy, the news of Harold's coronation was received with fury. William swore revenge and immediately began planning his invasion. Harold, in turn, prepared for war. He knew he would face a triple threat. In the north, his brother Tostig had allied himself with Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, who also claimed the throne. In the south, William's invasion was imminent. Harold Godwinson was king for only 9 months. and every one of them was spent in preparation for war. His rise was fast and undeniable at home, but outside his borders, it was the signal for the start of the largest invasion Anglo-Saxon England had ever seen, an event that would change the course of history forever. The news of Harold Godwinson's coronation in London, which reached Normandy, ignited William's fury and transformed his ambition into a meticulous and grandiose war plan. William did not see the invasion as just an adventure, but as a justified mission, a crusade to reclaim what he believed was his by right. From 1066, Normandy became a gigantic construction site and a military camp. The invasion project was one of the largest logistical undertakings of its time, requiring an unprecedented scale of preparation. The first step was to build a fleet. The forests of Normandy were cut down to provide wood for hundreds of vessels, from warships to transport ships. Chroniclers of the time estimate that the fleet had more than 700 ships, an impressive number that demonstrates the seriousness and scope of William's project. The construction of the ships was only one part of the challenge. The fleet needed to be manned by experienced sailors, and the ships needed to be supplied with food, water, and provisions for the crossing. The second challenge was to raise an army. William did not have a standing army, so he needed to recruit mercenaries and call his nobles for feudal service. He promised lands, riches, and titles in England to those who followed him. The promise was so tempting that nobles from all over France joined him, from Flanders, Brittany, and even Aquitaine. William's army was a multinational force, composed of mounted knights, the elite combat unit of the time, and a contingent of archers, a crucial weapon that the Anglo-Saxons did not possess to the same extent. The troops spent months training, simulating battles, and preparing for combat on English soil. To finance all this, William needed money. He imposed heavy taxes on his duchy and sought loans from bankers and merchants. The cost of the fleet, supplies, and mercenaries' salaries was astronomical. William's preparations were not a secret. Harold Godwinson in England knew that the invasion was imminent. William was building an unstoppable force, and he was determined to use it. The grandeur of his invasion plan, his determination to overcome logistical obstacles, and the vast mobilization of resources demonstrate that he would leave nothing to chance in his quest for the throne of England. For William the Conqueror, his claim to the throne of England was not just a matter of honor and power, but also of moral legitimacy. To give his invasion a weight that would distinguish it from a mere territorial conquest, he sought and obtained the support of the highest spiritual authority of Western Christendom, Pope Alexander II. This papal support was a masterstroke, transforming a war of conquest into a crusade, a mission sanctioned by God. Normandy, even in his time, was a duchy known for its religious devotion, and William's court was frequented by ecclesiastics. The Roman Church, in turn, was in a period of reform and sought to impose its authority over secular monarchs. William used Harold's alleged breach of oath as a pretext to obtain the Pope's support. Harold, he argued, had sworn on the sacred relics of Bayeux, an oath that, in the eyes of the Church, was unbreakable. By taking the crown of England, Harold not only betrayed William, but also sinned against God. The story of Harold being excommunicated for his betrayal is uncertain and widely debated, but the perception that William's invasion had papal sanction was real and crucial. Pope Alexander II, persuaded by William's ambassador, the Archdeacon Lanfranc, gave his consent and, more importantly, sent a papal banner and a ring to William. The papal banner was a powerful symbol, a visible sign to all Christians that the invasion was justified and holy. This papal sanction had a dual effect. First, it boosted the morale of William's troops, who were now fighting not only for wealth and land, but for a just cause. Second, it put immense pressure on the French nobles to join the invasion. For those who still doubted, the Pope had spoken, and their silence could be seen as a challenge to papal authority. The Church's support not only gave a sense of holiness to the invasion, but also neutralized any possible opposition from other Christian monarchs. William's conquest of England was not seen as a simple seizure of power, but as the punishment of a perjurer and the restoration of divine order. The Papal Crusade was a crucial element in William's story, a psychological and moral victory that gave him an invaluable advantage before the first ship even set sail. While William the Conqueror awaited favorable winds to cross the English Channel, Harold Godwinson's England faced a different and equally devastating threat in the north. Harold's traitorous brother, Tostig Godwinson, had allied with the feared King of Norway, Harald Hardrada. Hardrada, a legendary warrior and one of the most notable Viking leaders in history, also claimed the English throne, alleging a promise made to his predecessor, the Danish King Canute. Together, they led a powerful Viking fleet and landed in Northumbria, in the north of England. The threat was real and immediate. Tostig and Hardrada sacked the region and defeated local forces in a brutal battle. The news of the Viking invasion reached Harold Godwinson, who was in the south, waiting for the Norman invasion. The decision he made would be one of the most crucial mistakes of his life. He did not hesitate, and in a demonstration of his speed and determination, Harold marched his army north, on an impressive journey of about 300 kilometers, in just 4 days. The surprise was complete. On September 25, 1066, the armies of Harold Godwinson and Harald Hardrada met at Stamford Bridge. The battle was fierce and relentless. The Vikings, caught by surprise, were without their armor and were massacred. Harald Hardrada and Tostig were killed in combat. The victory was overwhelming, but the cost was high. Harold's army was exhausted and weakened by the forced march and the bloody battle. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a victory, but it was a Pyrrhic victory that, ironically, paved the way for defeat. While Harold Godwinson and his army celebrated, or tried to recover, the wind finally changed in Normandy. On September 27th, William the Conqueror's fleet set sail, and 2 days later they landed at Pevensey, on the south coast of England. News of the Norman landing reached Harold Godwinson while he was still in York. The exhaustion of his army, the loss of men, and the time spent in the north would be crucial factors in the approaching confrontation. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, although it eliminated one threat, left England vulnerable to the final invasion. And if this story surprised you, leave a like to help us spread knowledge and connect more people with history. After months of preparation and waiting, the decisive moment had arrived. The wind, which had for so long refused to cooperate, finally changed direction, blowing south. The signal was given, and the largest fleet ever assembled in Normandy, with about 700 ships, set sail. The crossing of the English Channel was a risky and audacious operation, a high-stakes gamble that could have ended in disaster. The English Channel is known for its treacherous waters and sudden storms. The fleet was overloaded with men, horses, supplies, and armaments. A storm could have sunk the fleet and ended William's ambitions before he even set foot on English soil. The crossing took place on September 27, 1066. The fleet, led by William's ship, the Mora, traveled at night guided by the stars. The silence of the sea was broken only by the sound of the waves and the creak of the wood. The journey was calm, and they arrived at dawn on the 28th. The chosen landing site was Pevensey Bay, on the coast of Sussex. The choice was not random. The region was sparsely populated and not under strong military control, and the site offered an ancient Roman fortress, which could be fortified and used as a base. The arrival was peaceful and unopposed. Harold's fleet, which had been patrolling the English Channel, had been disbanded due to lack of supplies and the approaching winter, a fatal decision for the English defense. William, with about 7,000 men, including 2,000 knights, landed and immediately began building a wooden castle and fortifying the position. They plundered the region for food and supplies, a deliberate tactic to lure Harold into a battle. William wanted the battle. He wanted the decisive confrontation, and he knew that Harold, a king who had just defended the north from a Viking invasion, would come. The successful crossing and the unopposed landing were the first steps to the conquest, and gave William the initial advantage he needed for the approaching battle. If you enjoyed diving into epic stories like this and seeing how the past shaped our present, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Every subscription, like, and share helps us spread knowledge and motivates us to bring you more stories like this. And if you could suggest the next story, what would it be? Leave your suggestion in the comments and tell us which city or state you're watching from. News of the Norman landing on the coast of Sussex, at Pevensey Bay, reached Harold Godwinson's ears in York, in the north of England. The king was still recovering from the Pyrrhic victory at Stamford Bridge, and his army was exhausted and depleted. The timing could not have been worse. Harold faced a brutal choice: stay in the north and allow William to plunder the south, or march south and face the invader with a tired army. Harold, known for his bravery and impulsiveness, chose the latter. He gave his men only a brief rest, and then, in an act of incredible determination, he led them on a forced march back south. In about 6 days, he covered the impressive distance of more than 300 kilometers, a journey that, while it seems like a demonstration of strength, was, in fact, a fatal mistake. He left York with his Anglo-Saxon army, which was already reduced and exhausted. He did not wait for reinforcements or for his militia army, the third, which was being gathered in the south. His haste was driven by anger and the need to protect his lands and family, who were in the south. Harold's march south was a race against time. He knew William was building fortifications and plundering the region. Harold's haste was his undoing. He marched with an army that was in precarious physical condition and arrived at Hastings, ready for battle, but at a strategic disadvantage. Harold's troops were hungry, tired, and had low morale. They were not ready for the battle that was to come. William, on the other hand, was well prepared. His men were rested, well-fed, and had high morale. They had had plenty of time to organize and prepare for the confrontation. What could have been an advantage for Harold, the speed of his march, became his greatest weakness. He arrived on the battlefield in an unfavorable condition, and his haste to confront William cost him his life, his crown, and his kingdom. Harold's march south, although a demonstration of bravery and loyalty to his people, was the decision that sealed the fate of Anglo-Saxon England. The date of October 14, 1066, resonates in history as the day the fate of England was decided. The Battle of Hastings was not fought in Hastings, but at a location about 10 kilometers from the city, at the top of a hill that is now known as Battle. The hill offered a tactical advantage for the Anglo-Saxons, who formed an impenetrable shield wall at the top of the slope. Harold's army, composed mainly of heavy infantry, the huscarls, and the local militia, the Fyrd, was in a strong defensive position, with the Norman cavalry unable to attack the shield wall on the way up. The day began with a Norman attack. William's archers, the first line of attack, launched a rain of arrows on the Anglo-Saxons. However, the shield wall proved to be an effective defense, and the rain of arrows caused few casualties. Then, the Norman infantry and cavalry attacked the slope. The battle was a brutal and bloody confrontation, with the Normans being repelled repeatedly by the shield wall. Legends say the battle lasted for hours, with waves of Norman attacks being repelled by the Anglo-Saxons. The feigned retreat tactic was the turning point of the battle. The Norman knights, after being repelled, faked a retreat. The Anglo-Saxons, inexperienced and believing that the Normans were fleeing, broke formation to pursue them. This break in formation was exactly what William wanted. The Normans then turned around and attacked the Anglo-Saxons in disarray. The tactic worked perfectly, and the Anglo-Saxons who pursued the Normans were massacred. This tactic was repeated a few times, and each time the Anglo-Saxon shield wall was broken, the Normans caused devastating casualties. The battle continued for hours. The shield wall, although weakened, resisted. The attack of the Norman archers was crucial. William ordered his archers to shoot high, in a parabolic trajectory, so that the arrows could fall on the heads of the Anglo-Saxons. This rain of arrows caused panic and broke the morale of the Anglo-Saxon army. The Battle of Hastings, a confrontation of tactics, leadership, and pure willpower, was about to end. The sun was already setting on the horizon, and the Battle of Hastings continued. The Anglo-Saxon shield wall, which had resisted for hours, was now in a state of disarray and despair. The definitive turning point came with the death of its leader, Harold Godwinson. Although there is no single and clear historical source on how he died, the most famous and enduring legend, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, is that he was hit in the eye by an arrow. The Bayeux Tapestry, a unique historical document and one of the most important artifacts of the Middle Ages, portrays the scene in graphic detail. The image shows a man, identified as Harold, with an arrow stuck in his eye. He leans over, trying to pull it out, while other soldiers rush to help him. The scene is one of the most iconic in history, and the image of the arrow in the eye has become synonymous with the Battle of Hastings. Harold's death, regardless of how it occurred, was the final blow to the Anglo-Saxon resistance. The king's death caused the immediate collapse of the army's morale and organization. The remaining Anglo-Saxons, now without their leader, began to flee. The Normans, seeing the opportunity, attacked with ferocity, pursuing the fleeing Anglo-Saxons. Night fell, and the battle finally ended. William and his army had won. The death of Harold Godwinson was more than just the loss of a military leader. It was the death of a kingdom's hope. The Anglo-Saxon nation was now without its king and without its protector. The road to London was open, and the fate of England was sealed. The legend of the arrow in the eye, although it may be a symbolic representation of the end of the Anglo-Saxon line of succession, still resonates today as the exact moment when the Old England succumbed to the invader. The battle had been won, but the conquest of England was still far from over. Harold's death was the end of the Battle of Hastings, but the beginning of a new era for England. With the victory at Hastings, the road to London seemed open, but the conquest of England was still far from complete. William's march toward the capital was slow, deliberate, and calculated, a striking contrast to Harold's haste. William did not want a direct battle for London. He wanted the city to surrender without a fight, and for that, he used a combination of force, intimidation, and patience. Instead of marching directly to London, William led his army in an arc through the south of England. He plundered and burned the towns and villages that refused to surrender. The devastation was a tactic of psychological warfare, sending a clear message to the Anglo-Saxons. Resistance was futile and submission was the only option. The news of the burned cities spread quickly and caused panic. William's march toward the capital was a demonstration of power and a way to subdue the country without having to fight. Advancing, William surrounded London. He camped at a strategic location near the River Thames and waited. The city, which was the capital and the political and economic heart of England, was now surrounded by a Norman army. The Council of Anglo-Saxon nobles, the Witan, was in a state of panic. They tried to choose a new king, and the choice fell on Edgar the Atheling, the young heir of the royal line. However, Edgar was too young and did not have the necessary military support to face William. The resistance, led by the powerful Earls Edwin and Morcar, was weak and divided. Faced with William's military strength and the lack of a strong and unified leader, the Anglo-Saxon resistance collapsed. The city's nobles, seeing the futility of fighting, went to meet William at Berkhamsted and surrendered. The surrender was a formal act. Edgar the Atheling, his advisors, and the most important bishops of the kingdom swore allegiance to William and invited him to be crowned king. William's march to London was a triumph of strategy over brute force. He conquered the capital without shedding a single drop of blood. The coronation, which was approaching, would be the final point of the conquest. The conquest of England was consolidated, and the final act of legitimation, the coronation, was about to happen. For the ceremony, William did not choose just any location. He chose Westminster Abbey, the same place where Harold Godwinson had been crowned earlier in the year. The location, Westminster Abbey, which had been built by Edward the Confessor, was a symbol of Anglo-Saxon royalty, and William's coronation there would be a clear message of continuity and legitimacy. The chosen date, December 25th, 1066, Christmas Day, was also symbolic. Christmas was the most important day of the Christian calendar, and the coronation on that date would be seen as an act blessed by God. The ceremony was grandiose but not without incident. In the middle of the ceremony, when the Norman and Anglo-Saxon nobles proclaimed their acceptance of William as king, the Norman Guard, thinking the shouts were of a riot, began to attack the population outside the abbey. The crowd, in a panic, fled, and the abbey was set on fire. The fire spread quickly, causing chaos in the city. William, however, remained in the ceremony, determined to see the coronation through to the end. He was anointed with sacred oil and received the royal regalia. The ceremony, although marked by a moment of chaos and violence, was a success. William the Bastard was now William I, King of England. The coronation solidified his conquest and legitimized him as the new monarch of the kingdom. However, his coronation did not mark the end of the Anglo-Saxon resistance. On the contrary, the coronation was the beginning of a new phase of the conquest, in which William would have to fight to keep his crown. The Anglo-Saxons saw William's coronation as a betrayal, and revolts and rebellions were inevitable. The Christmas coronation, although a symbol of the Norman victory, was also the beginning of a reign of oppression and revolt. The coronation was a turning point in the history of England. The Anglo-Saxon king had been replaced by a Norman king. The House of Wessex had come to an end, and a new era in English history was about to begin. The chaos and violence of the coronation ceremony were a foreshadowing of the years of conflict and revolt that would come. England, which had been conquered, would have to be subjugated, and the violence of William's coronation would be a small taste of what was to come. William's coronation in 1066, although it solidified his position as king, did not end the Anglo-Saxon resistance. The flames of rebellion soon flared up, and the first revolts were led by the powerful Anglo-Saxon earls. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, accustomed to having great autonomy, would not accept the authority of a foreign king who spoke another language. The revolts were not coordinated, but were a series of uprisings in different parts of the country, a demonstration that England, although conquered, was not subjugated. One of the first and most important revolts occurred in the north, led by Earls Edwin and Morcar, who had submitted to William. They rebelled in 1068, and the revolt spread quickly. To combat it, William marched north and crushed the rebellion with a brutality that would become his trademark. He built castles and fortresses in strategic locations to control the region, a tactic that would be used repeatedly in his reign. The revolt of Edwin and Morcar was followed by a series of others. In 1069, the Danish king Svein Estrithson, who also had a claim to the throne of England, landed on the east coast with a fleet. He joined the Anglo-Saxon rebels and the family of Harold Godwinson. The uprising was brutal, and the rebels plundered the city of York. The situation was serious, and William knew he had to act decisively. The union of the Danes with the Anglo-Saxons was a real threat to his hegemony. William responded with a campaign of terror. He marched north, crushing the resistance with relentless ferocity. He bought the loyalty of the Danes and paid them to leave, neutralizing one of the greatest threats to his crown. The rebellion of the Earls was a demonstration that the conquest of England would not be easy. The Anglo-Saxon resistance, although disorganized, was real. The revolts of Edwin, Morcar, and other nobles showed William that he would need more than the victory at Hastings to rule England. He would need a system of control and a brutal repression to subdue the country and consolidate his power. The rebellion of 1069, which united Danes and Anglo-Saxons in the north of England, was the last straw for William the Conqueror. He had tried to rule England with a mixture of force and conciliation, but the rebellion proved that conciliation would not work. William's response to the rebellion was one of the most brutal and controversial campaigns of his career, the Harrying of the North. This was not a battle, but a campaign of terror and mass destruction, designed to crush the resistance once and for all. In the winter of 1069-1070, William's army marched through the north of England with a simple order: destroy everything. The scorched earth campaign was relentless. Fields were burned, cattle were killed, and towns and villages were plundered and set on fire. People were killed or forced to flee to the forest to die of starvation. The goal was clear: to make the region so inhospitable that it could no longer sustain a rebellion. William's army burned crops and houses, and famine spread quickly. Chroniclers of the time report the devastation in terrifying detail. One of them wrote that the region of York, which was once one of the most fertile in England, became a desert. Thousands of people died of hunger and disease, and the devastation was so great that the region would take decades to recover. The harrying of the North was an act of state terrorism. William was not just punishing the rebels, he was sending a message to all of England. Disobedience would not be tolerated. The brutality of the scorched earth campaign achieved its goal. The resistance in the north was crushed, and the region remained subjugated for the rest of William's reign. However, the campaign also tarnished William's reputation, and he was criticized by some of his contemporaries for his brutality. The harrying of the north was an act of total war, a demonstration of relentless power that showed William that he was willing to do anything to keep his crown. The devastation of the North was one of the darkest moments in medieval English history, an act of oppression that consolidated William's authority, but at a terrible human cost. The reign of William the Conqueror was not just about battles and revolts, but about building a new system of control. One of his greatest innovations was the introduction of the castle system in England, a military and political tactic that would forever change the English landscape and society. The Anglo-Saxons had few stone fortresses, and castles were almost unknown in England before the arrival of the Normans. William used the construction of castles as a tool to consolidate his power and maintain control over the country. The first wave of castles was built soon after the Battle of Hastings. William and his barons built wood and earth fortresses, known as motte and bailey, mound and courtyard. The motte was an artificial hill of earth, on top of which a wooden tower, keep, was built. The motte was surrounded by a palisade, and a courtyard, or bailey, surrounded by a palisade and a ditch, was next to it. The system was simple but effective. The castle could be built quickly, and it served as a military base, a residence for the Norman lord, and a symbol of power and authority. William built more than 500 castles in his reign. He built them in strategic locations, near important cities, rivers, and ports, to ensure control of commercial and military routes. The castles were occupied by a garrison of Norman soldiers and became the center of local power. They were a constant reminder to the Anglo-Saxon population that they were under Norman rule. The construction of castles was also an act of oppression. To build the castles, Anglo-Saxon houses and properties were demolished, and the local population was forced to work. The castles were a symbol of a new order, and the Anglo-Saxon population viewed them with fear and resentment. The introduction of castles in England was not just a military tactic, but a social and political revolution. They created a new structure of power, with the Norman barons controlling the land from their fortresses. The castle system changed England forever and made large-scale resistance virtually impossible. The stone architecture that followed, with castles like the Tower of London, would become an enduring symbol of the Norman conquest. Among the vast network of castles that William the Conqueror erected throughout England to cement his power, the Tower of London stands out as the most iconic and symbolic. Its construction was not just a military necessity, but a powerful declaration of authority. Erected on the banks of the River Thames, at a strategic point to control the entrance to the capital, the tower was not just a fortress. It was the materialization of Norman domination, a physical and imposing reminder of who now ruled the city. The construction of the tower, which began soon after William's coronation, was a bold and large-scale initiative. The original structure was a wood and earth castle, but William quickly ordered the construction of a stone fortress, the White Tower, which would become the heart of the fortification. The construction, made with stones brought from Normandy, symbolized the imposition of Norman culture and architecture on the Anglo-Saxon landscape. The White Tower was the largest and most impressive military structure in England at the time, a masterpiece of engineering and a testament to William's power and determination. The Tower of London served multiple purposes. It was, first of all, a fortress, designed to withstand sieges and protect the king and his court. The tower by itself was one of the greatest obstacles the Anglo-Saxons would have to face. But the tower also served as a royal residence, a prison, an arsenal, and a vault for the royal treasures. It was the administrative and political center of the kingdom, and its dominant presence in the London landscape was a constant reminder to the population that resistance was futile. The Tower of London, with its massive architecture and its dark history of treason, imprisonment, and execution, became the symbol of Norman tyranny. For the Anglo-Saxons, it represented oppression and subjugation, the loss of their freedom, and the domination of a foreign king. For the Normans, it represented security, power, and authority. The construction of the Tower of London was a final act of domination, the imposition of a new power and a new order on the old capital. The tower was not just a fortress, but a monument to the conquest, and its history would become inextricably linked to the history of England. The conquest of England by William the Conqueror was not limited to a simple change of king. It was a social and political revolution that transformed the Anglo-Saxon elite, replacing it with a new dominant class of Norman barons. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, who had ruled England for centuries, was systematically stripped of their lands, titles, and power. And if this story surprised you, leave a like to help us spread knowledge and connect more people with history. The process of replacing the elite began soon after the Battle of Hastings. Those who had fought against William, or who refused to swear allegiance to him, had their lands confiscated. William redistributed the land to his barons and knights as a reward for their loyalty. The Norman nobles who had risked their lives in the invasion were rewarded with vast properties in England. The change in land ownership was one of the greatest impacts of the conquest. In a short period, most of the land in England, which had previously belonged to the Anglo-Saxon nobility, passed into the hands of the Norman barons. The replacement of the elite was more than just a change of landowners. It was a change of culture, language, and laws. The Norman barons spoke French and the royal court became bilingual. The Anglo-Saxon language, which was the official language of the kingdom, was relegated to a second language, spoken only by the lower classes. The Anglo-Saxon legal and administrative system was replaced by a Norman system, and the names of the new lords became the names of the new laws and the new castles. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, which had been the ruling elite, became an oppressed minority, and many were forced to live in poverty or flee to Scotland or other countries. The replacement of the elite was a brutal act of domination. However, it was also one of the factors that made William's conquest so long-lasting. By giving his barons a direct financial interest in maintaining control over England, William guaranteed the loyalty of his new nobility. The replacement of the elite was one of the most important legacies of the Norman conquest. The new nobility, who were loyal to William, ensured that England remained under Norman control for centuries, and the culture, language, and laws of England were permanently changed. The Norman conquest was not just a military conquest. It was a legal and administrative revolution that transformed the structure of English society. William the Conqueror introduced a completely new legal and land ownership system, which replaced the Anglo-Saxon system and cemented the power of the new Norman elite. The laws of land ownership, property, and inheritance were radically altered to favor the Normans and ensure their hegemony. The cornerstone of the new legal structure was the principle that all land in England belonged to the king. William declared himself the supreme owner of all the lands in the kingdom. He then redistributed the land to his barons, knights, and bishops in exchange for loyalty and military service. This system, known as feudalism, was a hierarchical structure in which power and wealth were based on land ownership, and loyalty and military service were the currency. The new inheritance laws were also changed to benefit the Normans. Under the Anglo-Saxon system, inheritance was often divided among the children, which led to a fragmentation of the land. Under the Norman system, the inheritance, especially titles and large properties, was transferred to the eldest son, which ensured that wealth and power remained in the hands of a few families. This change consolidated the power of the Norman barons and created a new class of landowners. The criminal laws were also changed. Justice, which was previously administered by local courts, was now controlled by the Norman barons. The Norman laws, which were more severe, were imposed on the Anglo-Saxon population. The Vergilde law, a man's monetary value, which was used to compensate his family in case of death, was abolished, and the death penalty became more common. The new laws, although brutal, were effective in imposing order and control. They were an instrument of power that ensured the subjugation of the Anglo-Saxon population and the hegemony of the new Norman elite. The new laws not only changed the structure of society, but also the way justice was administered. The Norman conquest was the cornerstone for the introduction of feudalism in England. Before 1066, England had a complex social and economic system, but there was no rigid feudal structure. William the Conqueror, by taking possession of all the lands in England, imposed a new order based on a system of loyalty and service. Norman feudalism was a hierarchical structure in which the king was the supreme owner of the land, and all others were his vassals. The system worked as follows. The king, who was the lord of all the land, distributed it to his barons, who became his vassals. In exchange for the land, the barons swore allegiance to the king and committed to providing military service, that is, to providing soldiers for the royal army. The barons, in turn, divided the land among their knights, who also swore allegiance and committed to fighting for their lord. The knights, in turn, controlled the lands and the peasants who cultivated them, who were the lowest in the feudal hierarchy. The feudal system was a social and military structure that guaranteed loyalty and control over the land. Loyalty was the currency. Land ownership was not absolute, but conditional on loyalty and service to the lord. If a vassal revolted, the land could be confiscated by the king. Feudalism created a new class of landowners, the Norman barons, who were loyal to William and who had a direct financial interest in maintaining control over England. The introduction of feudalism changed the way English society was organized. The land, which was once a property, became a fief, a benefit granted by the king in exchange for service. English society, which was previously divided between nobles, freemen, and slaves, was now divided into lords and vassals. The feudal system was an instrument of power that guaranteed the hegemony of the new Norman elite and the subjugation of the Anglo-Saxon population. It also consolidated the power of the king, who became the lord of all of England. The introduction of feudalism was one of the most enduring legacies of the Norman conquest, and the social and military structure it created remained in force for centuries. William's conquest of England was consolidated by force of arms, but his reign was solidified by an unprecedented act of bureaucratic administration, the compilation of the Domesday Book. In 1085, about 19 years after the conquest, William ordered a detailed survey of all the lands, properties, and goods in England to be carried out. The Domesday Book was not just a census. It was a tool of power, designed to consolidate the king's authority and to ensure that he knew exactly what he had conquered. The process was meticulous and exhaustive. The king's commissioners were sent to each shire, county of England. They met with nobles, clerics, and peasants to record every property. The questions were simple but crucial. Who owned the land before 1066? Who owned it now? What was the value of the property? How many watermills? How many animals? How many free men? And how many serfs? The wealth and property of each person were recorded, and the information was used to create a detailed record of Norman England. The name Domesday Book is significant. The word Domesday means doomsday, and the Anglo-Saxon population, who were interrogated and forced to reveal the extent of their property, saw the survey as a doomsday. The survey was so feared and so complete that it was believed that no information could be hidden from the king, just as nothing could be hidden from God on Judgment Day. The Domesday Book was the first complete census of medieval Europe, a feat of bureaucratic administration that demonstrates William's determination to rule England effectively. The Domesday Book had two main objectives. First, it was a record for taxation purposes. By knowing the wealth of each of his subjects, William could impose taxes more fairly and efficiently. Second, it was a record of property, which helped resolve land disputes and consolidate the king's authority over property. The Domesday Book was a landmark in governmental administration and a testament to William's ambition. He was not just a conqueror, but a ruthless administrator who used bureaucracy to consolidate his power. The Norman conquest not only changed the politics and society of England, but also its language. The arrival of the Normans introduced Norman French into the royal court and the nobility, and the English language, which was previously the language of the court and government, was relegated to a second category. English did not disappear, but it became the language of the lower classes, peasants, and workers. The Norman language became the language of power, law, administration, and high culture. The impact of Norman French on English was profound and long-lasting. Thousands of French words were incorporated into the English vocabulary, especially in areas such as law, politics, art, literature, and cuisine. Words like government, justice, parliament, liberty, and army are of French origin. The influence of French can also be seen in the grammar and syntax of English, which became simpler. The mixture of Anglo-Saxon English with Norman French created what we now know as Middle English, which is the basis of modern English. However, the mixture was not harmonious. The language was a barrier that separated the Norman elite from the majority of the Anglo-Saxon population. Communication was a challenge. The Norman nobles spoke French, and the Anglo-Saxon peasants spoke English. The few who spoke both languages were a link between the two cultures. The language became a symbol of status and power. The ability to speak French was a sign that you belonged to the elite, while the inability to speak it was a sign that you were a subjugated Anglo-Saxon. The influence of the Norman language was one of the most enduring legacies of the Norman conquest. The English language, which was a Germanic language, was enriched with French vocabulary and culture. The mixture of the two languages created a new language, which became the basis of modern English, and the language of one of the most influential nations in the world. The Norman language not only changed the vocabulary of English, but also its culture and history. While William the Conqueror consolidated his power throughout England, the flames of rebellion still flared up in some pockets of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The last and most notable of these uprisings was led by a legendary Anglo-Saxon resistance leader, Hereward the Exile. His story, although mixed with legend, is the story of the last attempt to save Anglo-Saxon England. If you like this part of the story, consider subscribing for more content like this. Hereward was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman who had been exiled in his youth, but who returned to England to fight against the Norman invasion. He became the leader of a group of rebels who hid in the swamps of the Isle of Ely, an ideal location for guerrilla warfare. The swamps offered natural protection, and Hereward and his men, who were known for their knowledge of the terrain, used the island as their base of operations. Hereward's revolts were a series of attacks against the Normans. He and his men attacked Norman castles, villages, and monasteries, and then disappeared into the swamps. Hereward's resistance was a thorn in William's side, who saw him as a real threat to his authority. Hereward's fame spread throughout England. He was seen as a hero, a symbol of Anglo-Saxon resistance against Norman tyranny. Legends about his bravery and cunning became part of English folklore. William tried to crush Hereward's rebellion several times, but without success. The Normans were not used to fighting in swamps, and Hereward's resistance was formidable. The climax of the revolt came in 1071, when William and his army surrounded the Isle of Ely. The fighting was intense, and the Normans were repelled several times. In the end, however, Hereward's resistance could not last forever. The climax came with the betrayal of local monks who, fearing for their lives, showed a path for the Norman army to invade the island. Hereward managed to escape, but his men were captured. Hereward's revolt was the last great Anglo-Saxon resistance against the conquest. Its defeat marked the end of hope that England could be freed from Norman rule. Hereward's story became a legend, a symbol of resistance and courage. He was the last Anglo-Saxon hero, and his struggle became part of the mythology of English history. His defeat was the final point of the conquest. William the Conqueror was a ruthless man, focused on power and ambition, but his personal life was deeply marked by the death of his wife, Queen Matilda of Flanders. William and Matilda's marriage, which lasted more than 30 years, was one of the most notable in the Middle Ages. Matilda was not just a wife, she was a trusted advisor, a competent regent, and a political force in her own right. The couple had 10 children, and Matilda's death in 1083 was a devastating personal blow to William. Matilda's death, which occurred in Normandy, left William in a state of deep mourning. He became more ruthless and more aggressive after his wife's death. The loss of his closest advisor and most loyal confidant had a profound impact on his personality. The pain of her loss was exacerbated by his rivalry with his eldest son, Robert Curthose, whom Matilda had supported. Her death removed the mediator between father and son, and the rivalry between the two intensified. Matilda's death was more than just a personal event. It was a turning point in William's story. She was his moderating force, the only person who could reason with him and influence his decisions. After her death, William became more impatient, more aggressive, and less prone to listening to advice. His behavior became more erratic, and he became involved in a series of conflicts with France and with his own son. The death of Matilda of Flanders, although it is just one event in the long history of William the Conqueror, is a reminder that even the most ruthless men are vulnerable to loss and grief. Her death had a profound impact on William's life and on the history of his reign. Matilda's death was the prelude to the end of William's reign and to the struggle of his children for power. The life of William the Conqueror was not without conflict, and the bitterest of all his struggles was the rivalry with his own eldest son and heir, Robert Curthose. The relationship between father and son was tense from the start, and the rivalry intensified as Robert became an adult. The cause of the conflict was simple. Robert wanted power, and he wanted it immediately. He was the heir to the Duchy of Normandy, and he believed it was time for his father to give him control of the duchy. The rivalry became an open war in 1077, when Robert, frustrated by his father's refusal to give him power, rebelled against him. He allied with French nobles and other enemies of his father, and the war became a personal struggle between the two. The rivalry was marked by a moment of drama and irony in 1079, when father and son faced each other in a duel. Robert, in an act of skill, disarmed and wounded his father. Legend says that Robert only recognized his father when he spoke and called him the Conqueror. The scene was a reminder of how bitter the rivalry had become. The rivalry with Robert Curthose was a thorn in William's side until the end of his life. Robert was a chronic rebel, and William had to spend time and money to subdue his own son. The rivalry was even more painful for William, as he knew that Robert was his heir, and he did not want the Duchy of Normandy to fall into enemy hands. The rivalry was a reflection of William's temperament. He was a man who could not tolerate disobedience, and the fact that his own son disobeyed him was a personal affront. The rivalry was proof that William's power and ambition were so great that he was willing to fight even against his own blood to maintain control. The rivalry with Robert Curthose was a stain on William's reign. He spent his last years fighting against his own son, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, cannot control family relationships. William's rivalry with Robert Curthose was the prelude to the division of the kingdoms after William's death, and the struggle between his children for power. The rivalry was a story of treason, pride, and ambition, and one of the most tragic in the history of William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was not only a military leader and a ruthless administrator, he was also a religious leader who maintained a complex and calculated relationship with the Church. His invasion of England, as we have seen, was sanctioned by the Pope, which gave him a moral and political legitimacy. However, his support for the Church was not just a matter of devotion, it was also a matter of power and control. William considered himself the spiritual and temporal leader of England, and he was determined to impose royal authority over the Church. One of William's first measures was to replace the Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots with Norman clerics. He appointed his friend and advisor, Lanfranc, as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest position in the Church of England. Lanfranc, who was an Italian cleric, was a reformer and a defender of papal authority, but he was also loyal to William. The replacement of Anglo-Saxon clerics with Normans was an act of domination, which ensured that the Church of England was under the king's control. William also used the Church to consolidate his power. He imposed new ecclesiastical laws, which ensured that the Church was under the king's jurisdiction. He controlled the appointment of bishops and abbots, and he also controlled the Church's wealth. He used the monasteries to collect taxes and to provide soldiers for his army. The relationship between William and the Church was a mixture of devotion and control. He was a religious man who believed in his divine mission, but he was also a king who believed in his right to rule the Church. William's relationship with the Church was a reflection of his personality and his ambition. He was a man who wanted to control everything, and the Church was no exception. His control over the Church was one of the factors that made his conquest so long-lasting. By controlling the Church, he controlled the morality and education of his kingdom, and he could ensure that the Anglo-Saxon population remained subjugated. His relationship with the Church was a testament to his ambition and one of the reasons for his success as king. The Norman conquest of England occurred in a period of great turmoil and transformation in the history of the Church. The Schism of 1054, the separation of the Eastern Catholic Church and the Western Catholic Church, although it occurred 12 years before the Battle of Hastings, had an indirect impact on William's relationship with the Pope and the legitimacy of his invasion. The division of the Church marked the beginning of a new era of papal authority, and the Roman Church, under Pope Leo IX, sought to impose its authority over the secular monarchs of Europe. The Schism of 1054 divided Christendom into two, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. The division was caused by theological and political differences, and the separation was a turning point in the history of the Church. The Roman Church, now without the opposition of the Eastern Church, became the main spiritual authority of the West. Papal authority, which was previously questionable, became unquestionable, and the Pope, now with unprecedented power, began to get involved in political issues, such as the succession of kingdoms. The support of Pope Alexander II for William the Conqueror's invasion must be seen in this context. The Pope, who sought to impose his authority on secular monarchs, used William's invasion as an opportunity to do so. The invasion, which was justified as a crusade to punish a perjurer, gave the Pope the opportunity to demonstrate his power and to assert his authority over England. The Pope's support for William was not a coincidence. It was a calculated act, designed to strengthen papal authority and to ensure that England was under the control of the Roman Church. The Schism of 1054, although it did not have a direct impact on William's invasion, created a political and religious climate that allowed the Pope to get involved in secular issues. His separation from the Eastern Church gave him the power and authority to bless William's invasion, and the invasion in turn strengthened papal authority. The relationship between William and the Pope was proof of the power of the Roman Church, and the Schism of 1054 was the basis for the papal authority that followed. The life of William the Conqueror ended in a dramatic and ironic way. The man who had conquered an entire kingdom, who had built a reputation for being ruthless and invincible, died in a humiliating way. In 1087, he was on a campaign against the King of France, Philip I, in the Duchy of Vexin. During an attack on the city of Mantes, William's horse, frightened by a fire, reared up and threw him against the saddle, which injured his abdomen. The wound, although not fatal, was serious and became infected. He was taken to the monastery of Saint-Gervais near Rouen, where he remained for several weeks, dying from his wound. William's death was slow and painful. He suffered from an intestinal infection and was in excruciating pain. On his deathbed, he repented of his life of violence and oppression. He confessed his sins and asked God for forgiveness for all the deaths and destruction he had caused. He also made the decision to divide his kingdom among his children. He bequeathed the Duchy of Normandy to his eldest and rebellious son, Robert Curthose, and England to his youngest son, William Rufus. The decision was an attempt to resolve the rivalry between his children, but it only served to create a new power struggle. William's death was an event of great irony. The man who had worried so much about his image and his reputation died in a humiliating way. His death was a reminder that even the most powerful men are vulnerable to the fragility of life. His death was also a moment of great turmoil. His advisors and his servants, seeing that he was dying, abandoned him, stealing all his belongings, even the clothes from his body. William the Conqueror, the man who had conquered an entire kingdom, was abandoned and robbed on his deathbed. William's body was taken to Caen, in Normandy, to be buried in the church he had built, but even his death would be marked by a series of dramatic events. William's body was so fat that it did not fit in the coffin, and an attempt to push it in caused the body to explode. The irony of his death was a reminder that William's life, although epic, was marked by a series of dramatic events, from his illegitimacy to his disastrous burial. His death was the end of his life, but the beginning of a new era of power struggle between his children. The end of William the Conqueror's life was marked by events as dramatic and bizarre as his rise to power. The attempt to bury his body in Caen, in the abbey he himself founded, became a macabre and humiliating spectacle, an ironic end to the life of a man so obsessed with control and dignity. William's body was taken from Mantes to Caen, but on the way, it was abandoned by his servants who fled with his belongings. When the body arrived, a fire broke out in the city, causing chaos and interrupting the funeral. William's coffin, which had been made for him, was too small. William's belly, which had grown over the years, was so large that he did not fit in the coffin. The clergy and those present tried to push him in, but the force of the air in his abdomen caused the body to explode, releasing a horrible odor that spread throughout the church. Those present, horrified, fled, and the funeral was interrupted. The scene, which was recorded by chroniclers of the time, is one of the most bizarre moments in medieval history. The man who had imposed his authority over an entire nation, who had forced his will on kings and nobles, could not even control his own body on his deathbed. The disastrous burial was a reminder of the fragility of power and the transience of life. The body that had been the tool of his ambition, the body that had conquered a kingdom, became the cause of his final humiliation. The disastrous burial was a fitting end to the life of a man who had lived a life of violence and ambition. The story of his burial became a legend, a moral tale about the futility of ambition. The story of William the Conqueror does not end with his death. It ends with the irony of his disastrous burial, a bizarre and humiliating end to an epic life. The legacy of William the Conqueror was not the union of his kingdoms, but their division. On his deathbed, he made a crucial decision that would change the history of England and Normandy. He bequeathed the Duchy of Normandy, his homeland, to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, and the Kingdom of England to his second son, William Rufus. The decision was an attempt to resolve the rivalry between his children, but it only served to create a new power struggle. Robert Curthose, who was the legitimate heir to the Duchy of Normandy, was rewarded for his loyalty. But he was not satisfied. He wanted England as well, and his rivalry with his brother became an open war. The division of the kingdoms created a scenario of political instability in Europe. The brothers, who were enemies, fought for years for control of their respective kingdoms. The struggle between the brothers was a thorn in the side of the kings of France and the other European monarchs. The division of the kingdoms had a profound impact on the history of England and Normandy. England, which had been united under the rule of one king, was separated from its homeland. The division of the kingdoms created a rivalry between the two that would last for centuries. Normandy, which was previously a part of England, became an independent duchy, and its history became the history of France. The division of the kingdoms was one of William's biggest mistakes. He did not foresee the consequences of his decision. He did not foresee that his children would fight for years for power, and that the rivalry between them would create a scenario of instability in Europe. The division of the kingdoms was a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, cannot control the future. The conquest of England by William the Conqueror was not just a military conquest. It was a cultural, social, and political revolution that shaped medieval and modern England. The Norman heritage in England is vast and long-lasting, and can be seen in the country's culture, architecture, politics, and language. Post-William England was a different country, and the legacy of the conquest was the basis for modern England. Norman architecture, with its stone castles, massive cathedrals, and monasteries, became the trademark of the English landscape. The Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and the cathedrals of Durham and Winchester are examples of the Norman style. Norman architecture was a symbol of power and authority, and its presence in the English landscape was a constant reminder of Norman domination. Norman culture, with its French language, literature, and laws, became the culture of the English elite. The English language, which was the language of the lower classes, was enriched with French vocabulary and grammar, and the mixture of the two languages created modern English. English literature, which was previously limited to religious hymns and epics, became more diverse and more influenced by French literature. Norman politics, with its feudal system, property laws, and centralized administration, became the basis of English politics. The Domesday Book, the Tower of London, and the Crown are examples of the Norman system. Norman politics consolidated the king's power and created a new social and military structure that became the basis of English society. The Norman heritage in England is vast and long-lasting. William's conquest was not just a military conquest, but a cultural revolution that shaped England forever. The legacy of the conquest is modern England, with its culture, its language, and its politics. The Norman heritage is proof of William's ambition and his determination to create a new kingdom. William the Conqueror is remembered not only for his conquests, but for his relentless temperament and his reputation as a tyrant. The accounts of his character, although often exaggerated by legend, paint the portrait of a complex man who was at once brutal and devout, cruel and loyal. If you want to know more about the life of William and other great leaders, don't forget to hit the notification bell for new content. The legend of his ruthlessness is well founded in history. The harrying of the North is an example of his brutality. He was a man who could not tolerate disobedience and who was willing to use violence to maintain control. His temperament was known to his nobles and his enemies. He was a man of few words, but of great determination. However, the legend of his temperament is only one part of the story. William was also a deeply devout man. He built churches and monasteries, and he considered himself a spiritual leader. He was a man who believed in his divine mission to rule England. His faith, however, did not prevent him from committing acts of violence. He believed that his brutality was justified, and that his mission was the will of God. The legend of his character is a reflection of his ambition. He was a man who could not tolerate opposition, and his quest for power and control led him to commit acts of violence. However, the legend of his character is also a reflection of his loyalty. He was loyal to his friends and his allies, and he was a man who did not forget his enemies. The legend of his temperament is a reminder that the story of William the Conqueror is not just the story of a conqueror, but the story of a complex man who was at once brutal and devout, cruel and loyal. His story is the story of a man who used violence to achieve his goals and who left a legacy of violence and oppression. The reign of William the Conqueror did not end with his death. It was the beginning of a new era for England. William's legacy is modern England. His conquest was not just a change of king, but a revolution that shaped the country's culture, language, politics, and society. Post-William England was a different country, and the legacy of the conquest was the basis for modern England. The consolidation of the monarchy was William's main legacy. Before the conquest, the English monarchy was fragile, and power was shared with the powerful nobles. William consolidated the king's power and created a centralized system of government. The English monarchy became stronger and more stable, and its authority was unquestionable. The integration of Norman and Anglo-Saxon cultures was another important legacy. The mixture of Norman and Anglo-Saxon culture and language created a new culture and a new language. The new language, English, became the language of one of the most influential nations in the world. The beginning of a new political scene in Europe was another important legacy. William's conquest of England changed the balance of power in Europe. England, which was previously an island nation, became a European power. His conquest was the beginning of a new era of European expansion and a new political scene in Europe. The legacy of William the Conqueror is modern England. His conquest was the beginning of a new era of transformation, and his story is the story of a man who changed the course of history.